Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is September 5th, 2022, and we're going to be asking, is the tide turning in Ukraine's favor? Let's get into it. Okay, so let's take a look at the latest updates. There are actually several. So working from north to south, there has been some interesting signs of progress, as you can see right here at the village of Ozerne. And you can see, I think this is significant because in order to achieve this liberation, you had to actually seize and cross a bridgehead. As we know, Russians have been held to the north side of the Dnipro River for months. And it has been extremely hard for them to get across, at least in many spots. They fought really hard to cross at Bohorodichne and were not successful. And now we're seeing Ukrainian forces actually push back and seize some territory on the north side of the Dnipro. This is really fascinating, and I was not expecting this, obviously, because by the Ukrainians' own admission, the focus of their offensive operation is in the south, in Kherson. But sometimes it can be effective to take targets of opportunity. And if you notice that Russian forces are both complacent or perhaps have even withdrawn many of their forces from this front, exploiting it, especially to seize territory as valuable as a bridgehead to the north of the Dnipro, is really, it can be very tactically significant. So this may, but the opposite is also true, right? This is a very thin resupply line, so it can be very hard to maintain the forces here, keep them resupplied, keep fresh fighting troops in, right? Move out broken equipment, get in new equipment, etc. It's very hard to do when you have this narrow bridgehead. So bridgeheads like this, they tend not to last long. They either expand out and secure additional bridgeheads, bringing more supplies in, or of course they get pushed back as the much better supplied enemy, right, is able to take advantage of their logistic superiority. So be very curious to see where this goes. Again, not really part of Ukraine's primary effort, and yet one of the more significant seizures of territory, or at least terrain, right? If not in area, in strategic value as one of the bridges across the Dnipro. When we look to the south, we see that there's also been some significant changes, particularly here, the village of Vysokopolia. You can see here that it's actually been steady progress over the last 3 days. It was contested and now is generally believed to have been seized on social media. There's pictures of the local hospital having Ukrainian flag flying above it. So it appears that this is reflective of an actual seizure of territory. Again, as we've talked about, if you've been on this channel for any length of time, you know that sort of salient areas like this are some of the most tactically vulnerable, right? You can see Russian forces outside this village are surrounded on 3 sides by Ukrainian forces, meaning that it's especially hard to establish defensive positions. So it just makes sense that the Russians would be forced to withdraw from this village, right? Whereas the fighting as these easy targets of opportunity, right? Probably something like this here, though the river certainly makes this difficult. So actually scratch that. It can be much, as we see when you're going to see the easiest to seize territory fall first, obviously, and the stuff that's just hardest to defend, easiest to attack. This is a good example of that. But the other change in territory, let's see if we can find it here. Oh, there it is, right up here. So this is more, again, this is interesting because as we discussed, this makes sense as a next logical target. You can see here, there is a small river running along here, and the Ukrainian forces have actually pushed the enemy back. And this is, again, logically a very easy piece of terrain to seize. You can see how easy it would be to just cut off this withdrawal route for Russian forces. And you can see the Ukrainians have significant territory to the northeast. This is a salient, right? They can't withdraw in any of the directions, and they don't control any of this territory. So presumably they could end up in a situation where Ukrainian forces are actually pressuring them from 3 sides. And you can see here that it appears that the region, assuming this wants to update, which it's thinking about it. Oh, man, this is had some issues. There we go. You can see the Russian forces have made the correct tactical decision to withdraw instead of being kind of trapped, cut off, and finished. Let's see if there's anything else. Enemy claims loss. Yeah, these are 2 villages that the enemy has actually claimed losses of. Here is one more where the Russians have actually reported that they have lost. This is this Lubomyrkiva. And yep, we can see here it's been contested. Russians have withdrawn. This is also interesting because this is actually, I mean, it's a little bit of the same situation where you have a little bit of a salient kind of poking out, but not necessarily, it's not necessarily the same sort of easy target where you surround the enemy on 3 sides. But this looks like very open terrain. So if you're going to see significant chunks of terrain being taken, it's going to be in these open farm fields where, frankly, there's just not a lot worth defending or easy to defend between these small villages. Okay, what is the sort of the larger picture here that I want us to think about as a viewer? Well, we've discussed what I think is Ukraine's overarching strategy here, and that is to pressure the Russian forces along several axes. And I think this is what we're seeing, right? We're seeing pressure here, we're seeing pressure here, here, and here, right? And that's what we've seen seizures of. That's what we've seen actual territorial losses. So I suspect that there's maybe potentially another axis maybe here that hasn't yet achieved territorial gains. But what do we think is going to happen? Well, what the Ukrainian forces, I suspect, are doing is what U.S. doctrine would consider, they're not really feints. They are courses of action. And what will happen is you apply pressure along these 4 axes and you start to seize territory. At some point, given the logistics and supply situation of the troops along this front, the Russian troops, eventually some of them will reach a breaking point in some piece of territory. And when they do, Russia will take its reserve forces held in the back, meant to dig in and hold Kherson, and they're going to commit them to that front to reinforce it. Once they do so, right, that reinforcement is going to create openings. It's going to mean that the backfield of all these other axes is going to be open. And so you'll see the Ukrainians surge, push hard on one of the other axes of advance. And once they do so, of course, presumably that weakened line is going to become the actual main thrust into the Kherson territory. Again, will this actually play out? The Russians may attempt to counterattack, right? You should expect back and forth fighting. This is the whole point, is to grind Russian forces down, make it a slog until the Russian commanders move their reserve and commit it to the fight. Once that happens, then you'll see, I suspect, Ukrainian forces push hard along another axis and really start to seize territory. Again, you can see here that even just by pushing this territory, they're achieving a similar effect, right? They're reminding the Russians they cannot withdraw too many forces from this eastern front here, because Ukrainians are absolutely willing to continue to go on offense, pushing and seizing territory here. So again, we're really hoping to see, I'll be curious to see how things go in the future, but I wouldn't sit there and take these gains as being signs of something permanent. I don't think this is going to be the direction of the offensive at large. I don't think we're going to see 4 different fronts of villages being seized one at a time. Eventually, we will see things go back and forth, and then we'll see a real decisive push. What else do we have, guys? Well, there are rumors. There's a couple of interesting news stories, but we'll focus on just one because there's certainly a lot of troop movement today. Putin's troops are not being paid. They were promised combat bonuses, and boy howdy, they are not getting them. In addition to combat fatigue and high casualties, there's also pay problems. And I can tell you, when you're even a soldier in garrison and you're not getting paid, you are pretty pissed. In Russian military, you have a modest core salary and a complex variety of bonuses and allowances. The problem is, of course, in Ukraine, well, it could be due to inefficient military bureaucracy and possibly some corruption among commanders. I can at least tell you that when I was deployed to Afghanistan, of course, they also had a complex system of bonuses and combat pay, many of which was tax-free. And that made a huge difference, right? As you can imagine. Similarly, but you had hazardous duty pay, combat pay. Depending on your status, you might draw airborne pay. So there was a wide variety of pay and allowances that you qualified for based on your combat service. But it was just really important to get that right, because for many soldiers, their service was providing for their families back home. And so if you believe that not only are you risking your life, but your children and family are unable to eat, are suffering back at home, that is a absolute crush to morale. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me. As you may have noticed, YouTube's censors are cracking down just a little bit, right? They're the most intense combat videos, the most intense combat leaks. They are all actually, I'm doing those on the Patreon. I still do some combat video breakdowns here on the main channel, but the spiciest ones are on the Patreon. And thanks, of course, to our Lieutenant tier patrons and all the patrons of Patreon who make this possible. Link is in the description. I'll see you guys in the next one.